The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and judgment, but Keisha N. Williams was only focused on the heat of the hand she had just seized, a hand the rest of the room treated like a death sentence. The Ashworth Winter Gala was legendary for two things: its ruthless elegance and its even more ruthless guests. Tonight, the ballroom resembled the inside of a diamond, all harsh angles and unforgiving light. Crystal chandeliers cast geometric shadows across floors, so polished they reflected every flaw, every imperfection, every person who didn't belong. Keisha felt each reflection like a knife as she stood near the champagne fountain, her forest green dress suddenly feeling threadbare against the sea of couture surrounding her. She hadn't wanted to come. Mrs. Pemberton, her employer, had insisted she accompany her as a personal assistant, which really meant standing in corners, fetching wraps, and enduring the casual cruelty of people who measured worth in bloodlines and bank accounts. Keisha had survived worse than sneers. The fire that had taken her childhood home had also taken the smooth, unblemished skin of her hands, leaving them marked with the kind of scars that told stories no one in this room wanted to hear. "My dear, are those work hands?" Lady Thornberry's voice cut through the Mozart quartet like shattering glass. The woman's eyes, cold, calculating, cruel, fixed on Keisha's grip around her champagne flute. "How wonderfully rustic! Do tell us, what sort of labor leaves such distinctive marks?" The surrounding circle of silk and diamonds tittered. Keisha felt the familiar burn of humiliation crawling up her throat, but she refused to let it show. She'd learned long ago that tears were currency she couldn't afford to spend. "A fire," Keisha said flatly, meeting Lady Thornberry's gaze with unflinching directness. "I was 8. My mother and I barely made it out." The laughter died, but the judgment remained, now mixed with a kind of horrified fascination. These people collected tragedies like art pieces, as long as they could observe from a safe distance. "How unfortunate," Lady Thornberry said, the word dripping with false sympathy. She turned to her daughter, a porcelain doll named Cecilia, who looked like she'd never experienced a moment of genuine hardship in her life. "Darling, perhaps we should have the staff check for any other unexpected guests. One can never be too careful about who handles the silverware." Something inside Keisha snapped. Not the quiet, internal kind of breaking that she'd learned to swallow down over years of slights and dismissals. This was different. This was the combustible anger of every condescending glance, every whispered insult, every door closed in her face because her hands told the truth about who she was and where she came from. Without thinking, without planning, without caring about the consequences, Keisha turned on her heel and walked away from the circle of sharks disguised as socialites. Her eyes scanned the ballroom desperately, looking for somewhere, anywhere, to escape the suffocating weight of their stares. That's when she saw the alcove. It was tucked into the far corner of the terrace, where the warm glow of the ballroom gave way to cool shadows. Most guests avoided it instinctively, their eyes sliding past it as if the darkness itself was contagious. Keisha had heard the whispers throughout the evening about the man who sat there, hidden from view. The cursed Duke, the shadow of Ashworth. Harvey K. Mart, the reclusive title holder whom no one had seen in years, who supposedly bore some terrible disfigurement or madness that made him unfit for polite society. Keisha had never put much stock in gossip. In her experience, the people society called cursed were usually just the ones who refused to play by its arbitrary rules. She moved toward the alcove with purpose, her scarred hands clenching into fists at her sides. If these people wanted to treat her like a pariah for having the audacity to survive, to work, to exist in their pristine world with evidence of her struggle written on her skin, then perhaps it was time to show them what a real pariah looked like. As she stepped into the shadows, she could make out a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black that seemed to absorb the light around him. He sat with the stillness of someone who had mastered the art of becoming invisible, even in sight plain. Keisha didn't hesitate. She reached out and grabbed his hand, gloved, warm, and surprisingly steady, and pulled. "If no one here is man enough to touch a hand that has actually worked," she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom, "then perhaps the cursed Duke will dance with me instead." The music stopped. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Even the champagne seemed to stop bubbling as hundreds of eyes turned toward the alcove in collective shock. And then he stood. Harvey K. Mart rose from the shadows like a king emerging from exile, and Keisha's breath caught despite herself. He wasn't disfigured. He wasn't cursed. He was, in fact, devastatingly handsome in the way that dangerous things often are. Sharp jawline, piercing eyes that seemed to see through pretense and straight into truth, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. But it wasn't his appearance that made Keisha's heart hammer against her ribs. It was the look in his eyes as they met hers, not anger at being dragged into the light, not humiliation at being used as a prop in her act of defiance. It was gratitude. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice low and rich like aged whiskey, "I thought you'd never ask." And as he led her onto the dance floor, their scarred and gloved hands intertwined, Keisha realized she had just set something irreversible into motion, something that would either destroy them both or save them from the prisons they'd built for themselves. The game, as they say, had begun. The waltz began with a single violin note, tentative and questioning, as if the musician himself wasn't sure whether to proceed. Keisha felt every eye in the ballroom boring into her back like hot coals, but Harvey's hand, firm and steady in hers, kept her anchored to the moment. "You're trembling," he observed quietly as they began to move. His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "I'm furious," Keisha corrected, though she knew he was right. Adrenaline coursed through her veins like wildfire. "There's a difference." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Is there? I've found the two often feel remarkably similar." They moved across the floor with surprising synchronicity, considering they'd never met before this explosive introduction. Harvey led with the kind of confidence that came from years of formal training, but there was something else there too, a carefulness, as if he was acutely aware that one wrong move could shatter whatever fragile understanding existed between them. "You've caused quite the spectacle, Miss Williams," he said, his eyes flickering briefly toward the frozen crowd. "The ton will be discussing this for months, years perhaps." "Good." Keisha lifted her chin defiantly. "Let them talk. They were already discussing my hands as if I was some curiosity in a freak show. At least now I've given them something worth gossiping about." Harvey's expression shifted, something dark and knowing passing through his features. "Ah, so you're my weapon of choice, the monster you've unleashed to prove a point." Guilt pricked at Keisha's conscience, sharp and unexpected. In her rage, she hadn't considered what it meant to drag this man, reclusive, private, deliberately hidden, into the spotlight. She'd used him as carelessly as Lady Thornbury had used her words. She began, but Harvey cut her off with a gentle squeeze of her hand. "Don't apologize," he said. "It would ruin the effect. Besides, you've done me a favor." "A favor?" Keisha couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "I've just made you the center of attention in a room full of vultures." "Exactly." His eyes met hers, and Keisha saw something burning there. Not anger, but a kind of fierce, long-suppressed defiance. Do you know how long I've sat in that alcove, Miss Williams? 3 years. 3 years of attending these insufferable events as a duty to my title, hiding in shadows, because the alternative, facing their pity, their curiosity, their endless speculation about why I choose solitude, felt more exhausting than simply disappearing. The music swelled around them, and Harvey spun her with unexpected grace. For a moment, Keisha forgot about the audience, forgot about the whispers that were surely multiplying like bacteria in a petri dish. There was only the movement, the rhythm, and this strange man who somehow understood. "But you're not disfigured," Keisha said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. The rumors said many things." Harvey's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "None of them true. But lies are easier to believe than the simple fact that someone might choose to reject society rather than beg for its acceptance." Keisha understood that sentiment in her bones. Then why come at all? Legal obligations, estate matters, the tedious maintenance of a duchy I inherited but never wanted. His voice carried the weight of years of resentment. "But now, thanks to your rather dramatic intervention, I suspect those obligations are about to become far more complicated." As if on cue, Keisha caught sight of a distinguished older man pushing through the crowd, his face purple with barely contained rage. Behind him, a perfectly coiffed woman in ice-blue silk smiled with the kind of malice that came from generations of practiced cruelty. Harvey's cousins, Keisha guessed. "The vultures have landed," Harvey confirmed, but his grip on her hand didn't falter. "Still want to dance with the cursed Duke, Miss Williams?" Keisha thought of Lady Thornbury's sneering face, of every door that had been slammed in her face, of the scars she carried, both visible and hidden. She thought of how good it felt to finally do something instead of simply enduring. "Until the music stops," she said firmly. Harvey's smile was genuine this time, transforming his entire face. "Then let's give them a show worth remembering." The waltz ended with a flourish that felt more like a declaration of war than a conclusion. As the final note hung in the air, Harvey didn't release Keisha's hand. Instead, he led her toward the terrace doors with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he was done asking permission for anything. "Your Brace, a word." Harvey's cousin, the purple-faced man, attempted to intercept them, but Harvey brushed past him with the casual dismissal of someone swatting away a particularly persistent fly. "Later, Edmund. I'm occupied." The cool night air hit Keisha's flushed cheeks like a blessing. Behind them, the ballroom erupted into frenzied whispers. But out here, surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges and the distant sound of a fountain, there was something approaching peace. Harvey finally released her hand, and Keisha immediately felt the loss of that anchor. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how reckless she'd been. What had she expected? That she'd embarrass Lady Thornbury and walk away unscathed? That there would be no consequences for weaponizing a duke? "You're allowed to regret it," Harvey said, reading her thoughts with unnerving accuracy. He leaned against the marble balustrade, his silhouette sharp against the city lights below. "Most people do after they've acted on impulse." "I don't regret it," Keisha said, though her voice lacked conviction. I didn't think beyond the moment." "The mark of every good revolution," Harvey said, reaching up and beginning to remove his gloves with deliberate, almost ritualistic care. "We act first, calculate consequences later. It's the only way anything ever changes." Keisha watched, mesmerized, as he peeled away the black leather. She expected smooth, aristocratic hands, the kind that had never known labor, never felt the bite of harsh soap or the weight of real work. What she saw instead made her breath catch. His hands were scarred, not like hers. Hers weren't from fire, but they bore the evidence of something violent nonetheless. A network of thin white lines crisscrossed his knuckles and palms, the kind of marks that came from broken glass or perhaps broken promises. "You said I wasn't cursed," Harvey said, holding his bare hands up to the moonlight. "You were right. I'm not cursed. I'm just weary, Miss Williams. Weary of pretending that perfection is something worth aspiring to when we're all just walking collections of damage and survival." Keisha stared at those scars, feeling something shift in her chest, a recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. What happened? "A riding accident when I was 15. The horse spooked, threw me through a greenhouse. They saved my hands, but not without cost. My father was mortified, a duke's son marked like a common laborer. He spent years trying to hide it, making me wear gloves at all times, as if the scars themselves were shameful. They're not shameful, I mean." Harvey's eyes met hers, and in them Keisha saw the same defiance she'd felt on the dance floor. "No, they're not, but society has very particular ideas about what makes a person presentable, acceptable, worthy of being seen." He took a step closer, and Keisha's heart began to hammer again. "May I?" She understood what he was asking. Slowly, deliberately, she held out her own hands, those rough, scarred, working hands that Lady Thornbury had mocked, the hands she'd spent years trying to hide in pockets and gloves and long sleeves. Harvey took them gently, turning them over in the moonlight, as if examining precious artifacts. His thumbs traced the raised tissue where fire had rewritten her story onto her skin. "These," he said quietly, holding his bare hands up to the moonlight, "are the most beautiful things in that entire ballroom." Keisha's throat tightened. "You don't have to. I'm not being kind, Miss Williams. I'm being honest." His grip tightened just slightly, anchoring her to the moment. "Do you know what I see when I look at these hands? Survival, resilience, the evidence of someone who has actually lived, who has fought and endured and refused to disappear just because the world suggested it might be easier." He looked up, his gaze intense. "Everyone in that ballroom has smooth, perfect hands because they've never had to fight for anything. Their hands are beautiful because they're empty. Yours tell a story worth reading." Something cracked open inside Keisha, some defensive wall she'd built so carefully over the years. She expected pity, or worse, the kind of performative sympathy that people like Lady Thornbury specialized in. She hadn't expected this, genuine recognition from someone who understood what it meant to be marked by life. "Why did you really sit in that alcove?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harvey's smile was sad and knowing. "Because I was waiting for someone brave enough to drag me out of it, someone who needed me as much as I needed them. I think, Miss Williams, you and I are about to become very dangerous together." Behind them, the terrace doors opened, and Edmund's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Harvey, we need to discuss this situation immediately." The revolution, it seemed, was just beginning. Keisha woke to the sound of her landlady pounding on the door with the enthusiasm of someone delivering news of the apocalypse. "Miss Williams, there's a carriage outside, a ducal carriage with the Ashworth crest." Mrs. Patterson's voice vibrated with scandal and poorly concealed excitement. "What on earth did you do last night?" Keisha groaned, pulling her thin pillow over her face. What had she done? Only grabbed the most reclusive duke in London and forced him into the social spotlight like some kind of deranged puppeteer. She'd spent the night tossing and turning, replaying every moment, every word, every touch of his scarred hands on hers. "Tell them to go away," she called out, though she knew it was futile. "Tell a duke to go away? Have you lost your mind entirely?" Mrs. Patterson's footsteps retreated down the narrow stairs, muttering about respect and propriety, and young women who clearly had neither. Keisha dragged herself out of bed and caught sight of her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above her wash basin. She looked exactly like someone who'd spent the night contemplating the destruction of her already precarious social standing. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair, which she'd painstakingly styled for the gala, now resembled a bird's nest after a storm. By the time she made herself marginally presentable and descended to the building's shabby entrance hall, she'd prepared 17 different speeches, ranging from abject apology to defiant justification. None of them seemed adequate. Harvey stood in the doorway like a panther in a canary cage, too large, too refined, too impossibly out of place in the peeling wallpaper and faded carpet of her world. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual rent, but his eyes held the same knowing weariness from the night before. "Your Grace," Keisha began, clasping her hands behind her back to hide their trembling, "I owe you a drink, I think. Perhaps tea. I've heard this establishment has character." Mrs. Patterson materialized from the shadows like a stage actress awaiting her cue. "We have a parlor, small but clean. I'll bring tea immediately, Your Grace, the good china." Before Keisha could protest, she found herself ushered into the cramped sitting room that Mrs. Patterson reserved for special occasions, which, judging by the dust on the side table, hadn't occurred in several years. Harvey settled into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight, seemingly unconcerned by his surroundings. He pulled a folded newspaper from his coat and placed it on the table between them. "Have you seen the morning editions?" Keisha's stomach dropped. The headline screamed across the page in bold, accusatory typeface. "The Cursed Duke Dances. Mystery Woman Drags Ashworth from Shadows. Society Demands Answers." Below it, a smaller headline added fuel to the fire. "Working-class opportunist or romantic savior. Miss K. Williams divides opinion." "Oh, God," Keisha whispered, sinking into the chair across from him. "There are 4 other papers with similar stories. The Times called you refreshingly audacious. The Chronicle suggested you were a paid actress hired to humiliate me. The Society Gazette has already started a betting pool on whether we'll be engaged by month's end." "Oh, dear," Keisha whispered, sinking into the chair across from him. "This," Harvey corrected, leaning forward with sudden intensity, "is an opportunity." Keisha looked up sharply. "An opportunity for what? Public humiliation? Social exile? I work for Mrs. Pemberton, Your Grace. Worked, probably, past tense, because I guarantee she's already heard about this and decided I'm too scandalous to employ. Good, because I'm offering you a different position." The room fell silent, except for the distant clatter of Mrs. Patterson preparing tea with unusual vigor. Keisha stared at Harvey, trying to decipher whether this was charity, pity, or something else entirely. What kind of position? Companion, advisor, professional shield against predatory relatives. Harvey's expression turned grim. "My cousin Edmund and his wife Marguerite have been circling for years, waiting for any excuse to declare me unfit for the duchy. Last night, you inadvertently proved I'm still capable of social interaction, which complicates their plans considerably. They'll come after you now, try to discredit you, use you as evidence of my poor judgment. So you want me to, what? Pretend we're friends? Allies? I want you to help me stay visible long enough to secure my position permanently. In exchange, I'll pay you more than Mrs. Pemberton ever could, provide housing, and ensure that when this is over, you'll have the resources to build whatever life you choose." He paused, studying her face. No strings, no expectations, beyond mutual survival. Keisha's mind raced. It sounded too good, too convenient, too much like the kind of fairy tale that never came true for girls like her. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could hire anyone." Harvey's smile was slight but genuine. Because you grabbed my hand when everyone else was too afraid. Because you understand what it means to be an outsider. Because I think, Miss Williams, we might actually be able to save each other." Outside, the city buzzed with scandal. Inside this shabby parlor, Keisha felt the future shifting beneath her feet like tectonic plates finding new alignment. When do I start?
The Ashworth estate wasn't what Keisha expected. She'd braced herself for oppressive grandeur, oil paintings of disapproving ancestors, heavy velvet drapes, the suffocating weight of old money and older traditions. Instead, Harvey's car pulled up to something that looked like it had been carved from light and air. The house was a study in contradictions, glass walls that seemed to dissolve the boundary between inside and outside, clean white surfaces that somehow felt warm rather than cold, and furniture so minimal it bordered on defiant. This wasn't a home designed to impress visitors. This was a sanctuary built by someone who'd spent too long performing for an audience that never appreciated the show. "It's not what the family wanted," Harvey said, reading her silence as he carried her single, battered suitcase, he'd insisted despite her protests, through the entrance. "My father's estate manager nearly had an aneurysm when I renovated, said I was destroying centuries of tradition." "It's perfect," Keisha said honestly. The space felt like breathing after years of holding her breath. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked manicured gardens that transitioned seamlessly into wild forest. The bed was dressed in crisp white linens, and the bathroom featured a tub deep enough to drown in, or perhaps, Keisha thought, to finally wash away the grime of barely surviving. "Settle in. Dinner is at 7, though I'm terrible company, and usually eat while reading legal documents, so no pressure." Harvey paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "The house is yours to explore. Nothing is off-limits except the West Wing office during business hours. Oh, and there's a music room on the second floor. The piano hasn't been played in years." He left before Keisha could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the sound of purposeful retreat. She found the music room 2 hours later after unpacking her meager belongings and taking a bath that felt more like baptism than hygiene. The room occupied the entire eastern corner of the second floor, wrapped in glass that caught the afternoon sun and transformed it into liquid gold. The piano sat in the center like a black jewel, a Steinway grand that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Keisha approached it cautiously, her scarred fingers hovering over the keys. She hadn't played since before the fire, since her mother's battered upright had burned along with everything else. The first note rang out clear and pure, and something inside Keisha's chest cracked open. Her fingers found the keys like coming home, muscle memory overriding years of absence. She played Chopin, his Nocturne in E-flat major, because it was the last piece her mother had taught her, because it was beautiful and sad and perfectly suited to this glass room suspended between earth and sky. She didn't hear Harvey enter, didn't notice him standing in the doorway until the piece ended and his voice cut through the silence. "I didn't know you played." Keisha's hands flew to her lap, embarrassment flooding through her. "I'm sorry, I should have asked." "Don't." Harvey moved into the room, his expression unreadable. "Don't apologize for making this house sound like something other than a mausoleum." He gestured to the piano bench. "May I?" She shifted over, and he sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the space between them. Up close, she noticed details she'd missed before, the faint scar at her temple, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the way his hands hovered over the keys with the same hesitation she'd felt. "I used to play," he said quietly, "before the accident. After, I told myself my hands were too damaged, that I'd lost the dexterity." He flexed his scarred fingers experimentally. "The truth is, I was afraid that the one thing I loved would reject me the way society had. And now? Now I think perhaps I've been hiding for too long." He played a single chord, C major, simple and foundational. "Show me something, anything." Keisha placed her hands over his, guiding his fingers to the keys. Together they played a scale, halting, imperfect, but undeniably real. His hands were warm beneath hers, trembling slightly with the vulnerability of someone attempting something long abandoned. "See," she said softly, "still works. The scars don't matter." Harvey turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "They matter," he corrected. "They just don't have to mean what we thought they meant." They sat there as the sun set beyond the glass walls, two scarred people finding rhythm in the wreckage, and Keisha realized with startling clarity that this arrangement, this mutually beneficial alliance, was becoming something far more dangerous than either of them had planned. In the growing darkness, Harvey began to play on his own. The melody was uncertain, fragile, but it was his. And Keisha, watching his scarred hands coax beauty from silence, understood that some fortresses were built not to keep people out, but to protect what was most precious within.
There came on a Thursday morning, unannounced and unwanted, like a plague dressed in Chanel. Keisha was in the conservatory reading. Harvey had given her access to his library, and she'd been working through his collection of philosophy texts with the hunger of someone long denied intellectual nourishment, when the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared with an expression of profound disapproval. "The Honourable Edmund Ashworth and Mrs. Marguerite Ashworth to see you, Miss Williams. They insist His Grace need not be disturbed." The way Mrs. Chen said "insist" made it clear she thought otherwise. "Where's Harvey?" "Conference call with the estate solicitors. He left instructions not to be interrupted unless absolutely necessary." Keisha closed her book, her heart rate accelerating. This was a test, then, a deliberate strike when Harvey's shield was lowered. She could send them away, claim illness, hide behind propriety, or she could do what she'd done at the gala, meet the threat head-on. "Show them to the morning room," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'll be there shortly." She took her time, letting them wait, changed from her comfortable reading clothes into one of the simple but well-cut dresses Harvey had arranged to have delivered, armor, he'd called them, for the battles ahead. Applied lipstick like war paint, braided her hair back severely, refusing to hide her face or soften her edges. When she entered the morning room, Edmund and Marguerite were standing by the windows, their backs to her, examining the minimalist space with barely concealed disdain. Edmund was precisely purple-faced as she remembered. Marguerite looked like a portrait of aristocratic cruelty, all sharp angles and sharper eyes, her blonde hair swept into a chignon so tight it must have given her headaches. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth," Keisha said coolly. "What an unexpected visit." Marguerite turned, her smile as warm as January frost. "Miss Williams, how quaint finding you here, playing house in Harvey's little glass box." "I live here," Keisha corrected, "as His Grace's advisor and companion. Perhaps you weren't aware of the arrangement." "Oh, we're aware. The entire city is aware. It's all anyone discusses. The common girl from the docks, mysteriously elevated to a position she's spectacularly unqualified for." Keisha felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but refused to let it show. "Is there something I can help you with, or did you drive across the city simply to insult me in Harvey's home?" "We came," Marguerite said, settling onto the sofa as if she owned it, "to offer you an opportunity, a kindness really, though I suspect you're too stubborn to recognize it as such." "How generous!" Marguerite's eyes glittered. "Harvey is not well, Miss Williams.
Oh, he functions adequately, manages the estate, signs the necessary documents, but he's been deteriorating for years. The isolation, the paranoia, the refusal to fulfill his social obligations, and now this peculiar attachment to you, a woman he met through what can only be described as an act of public desperation. You mean when I asked him to dance? Keisha kept her voice level, though anger simmered beneath her skin like magma. When you used him as a prop in your tantrum, Edmund corrected sharply. You embarrassed yourself, and in doing so, you've given us ammunition to prove what we've known for years. Harvey is unfit to manage the duchy. His judgment is compromised. By me, you mean? By his inability to recognize opportunism when it presents itself in a pretty package. Marguerite leaned forward, her expression shifting from contempt to something approximating sympathy, though Keisha recognized it as the performance it was. We're prepared to offer you £50,000 to leave, quietly, today. Tell the papers it was a misunderstanding, that Harvey was kind to you, but that you've realized you don't belong in this world. The number hung in the air like bait. £50,000, more money than Keisha had ever imagined possessing, enough to start over, to build a real life, to never worry about rent or hunger or landlords who looked at her with pity. Enough to betray the one person who'd seen her scars and called them beautiful. No, Keisha said simply. Edmund's face darkened. You're making a mistake, girl. We can destroy you. One word to the right papers, one strategically placed rumor, and you'll be unemployable, unmarriageable, untouchable. I've been untouchable my entire life, Keisha said, standing. Your threats are just prettier versions of insults I've heard since childhood. The difference is, I'm not alone anymore, and I'm not ashamed. She moved toward the door, opening it in clear dismissal. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Mrs. Chen will show you out. Marguerite rose slowly, her composure cracking at the edges. Harvey will tire of you. He always tires of his project. Then that's between Harvey and me, Keisha met her gaze unflinchingly, not you. After they left, Keisha stood in the morning room, her hands trembling with residual adrenaline. Through the glass walls, she could see their car disappearing down the drive, and she realized something profound. She hadn't just defended Harvey, she'd defended herself, her worth, her right to exist in spaces that had always tried to exclude her. She was more than just a girl from the docks. She was someone who brabbed dukes and refused bribes and stood in glass houses without fear of shattering.
The storm came without warning, turning the glass fortress into a house of percussion. Rain hammered against the windows with violence that felt personal, and lightning illuminated Harvey's minimalist sanctuary in harsh, fragmentary bursts. Keisha found him in the library at midnight, standing before the windows with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. He'd removed his jacket, loosened his tie, and in the storm's intermittent light he looked less like a duke and more like a man barely holding himself together. Mrs. Chen told me about the visit, he said without turning. Edmund and Marguerite. I handled it, I know. She also told me they offered you money. Now he turned, his expression unreadable in the darkness. £50,000, that's more than generous, more than I'm paying you. Keisha's chest tightened. If you're asking whether I considered it, I'm asking why you didn't take it. Harvey set down his glass with deliberate care. I'm asking why you're still here, when leaving would be the rational choice, the safe choice. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the foundations. Keisha moved closer, close enough to see Harvey's exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. Why did you really sit in that alcove for 3 years, Harvey? He flinched at the directness of the question. I told you, duty, legal obligations. That's the answer you give to papers and solicitors. I'm asking for the truth. The silence stretched between them, taut as piano wire.
When Harvey finally spoke, his voice was raw with something Keisha had never heard before, naked honesty, stripped of all aristocratic polish. "Because I'm a coward," he said. "Because after the accident, my father made it clear that I was an embarrassment, damaged goods in a family that prized perfection above everything, including humanity. He spent years teaching me to hide, to minimize, to be seen but never truly visible." Harvey's hands clenched at his sides. "When he died and I inherited the duchy, I told myself I was choosing isolation. The truth is, I was just following his final lesson: disappear before they can reject you." Keisha's throat ached with recognition. "My mother died 2 years after the fire, pneumonia officially, but I think she died of exhaustion, from watching people recoil when they saw my hands, from trying to convince me I was still beautiful when the world had decided otherwise." She held up her scarred hands, letting the lightning illuminate every ridge and valley. "I spent years hiding these: gloves, long sleeves, pockets, anything to avoid the stares, the pity." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think my mother would have wanted me to stop hiding, to find someone who understood that scars aren't shameful, they're just proof we survived." Harvey closed the distance between them in 2 strides. Without asking permission, he took her hands in his, turning them over in the storm light. His touch was different now, not the formal dance-hold or the gentle examination from the terrace, but something intimate and deliberate. He traced each scar with his thumb, mapping her history through touch. "Here," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain, "this one goes all the way to your wrist. That's where the door handle was. It was metal. I grabbed it without thinking. Brave, or perhaps terrified. Sometimes they're the same thing." "Your turn," Keisha said, reaching for his hand. She pushed up his sleeve, revealing scars that continued far beyond his hands, a network of silver lines that tracked up his forearm like rivers on a map. "These aren't all from broken glass." Harvey's jaw tightened. "No, some are from breaking the glass myself, when I was 17, angry, convinced that if I was already damaged, I might as well control the destruction." He met her gaze, unflinching. "I stopped before it became irreversible, but the scars remain, a reminder of how close I came to becoming the monster they expected." Keisha's heart cracked open. She understood that impulse, the desire to hurt yourself before the world could do it for you, to maintain some illusion of control over the inevitable pain. "We're quite a pair," she said softly, "2 people who tried to erase themselves and somehow found each other." Keisha, the way he said her name, her first name which he'd never used before, felt like crossing a threshold. "This arrangement we made, this deal, I know. It's not enough anymore. I can't pretend this is just strategy or mutual convenience." His hands tightened on hers. "I can't pretend I don't wake up thinking about you playing piano in that glass room, that I don't spend meetings mentally composing arguments you'd use against Edmund, that I don't feel like I can finally breathe for the first time in years." The storm raged outside, but inside, the world had narrowed to the space between them, barely inches, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. "I'm still just a girl from the docks," Keisha whispered, "and I'm still just a broken duke hiding in a glass house." Harvey's smile was sad and hopeful and utterly devastating, "but perhaps we're enough together." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously. His scarred hands cradled her face with reverence, and Keisha's scarred hands gripped his shoulders like anchors. The deal was dead. What remained was infinitely more dangerous: truth, vulnerability, and the terrifying possibility of actually being seen. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, 2 people stopped hiding.
The accusation arrived with a morning post delivered by a process server who looked apologetic and a lawyer who decidedly did not.
Keisha was having breakfast with Harvey in the conservatory, their new ritual, coffee and silence and the comfortable intimacy of two people learning to exist in the same space, when Mrs. Chen appeared, her face ashen. "Your Grace, there are gentlemen here. They have documents." The lawyer was a sharp-faced man named Reginald Blackwood, who specialized in estate law and clearly relished his role as harbinger of scandal. He spread papers across Harvey's breakfast table with the precision of someone laying out evidence at a crime scene. "A matter of some delicacy has come to my attention," Blackwood began, his tone suggesting he found nothing delicate about it whatsoever. "My clients, Mr. Edmund Ainsworth and Mrs. Marguerite Ainsworth, have discovered certain irregularities in the estate accounts, specifically the disappearance of several valuable items coinciding with Miss Williams's residence here." Harvey's expression went dangerously cold. "What items?" "A diamond bracelet belonging to the late Duchess of Ainsworth, valued at approximately £30,000, a first-edition set of Byron's works from the library, worth another £15,000, and various pieces of silver from the dining room." Blackwood produced photographs, itemized, catalogued, damning. "All reported missing in the past 3 weeks." Keisha's stomach dropped. She stared at the photographs as if they might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. "I didn't take anything. I wouldn't—" "Of course you'd deny it," Blackwood interrupted smoothly. "However, my clients have also uncovered evidence of significant debts in your name, outstanding rent, medical bills from your late mother's illness, loans from less than reputable sources, the kind of financial pressure that might motivate someone to supplement their income." "This is absurd," Harvey said, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Keisha has access to anything she needs. There's no reason for her to steal." "Unless," Blackwood suggested, "the debts are more substantial than you're aware. Unless Miss Williams saw an opportunity to solve her problems and took it, counting on your affection to protect her from consequences." The word affection dripped with insinuation. Keisha felt the world tilting, the familiar sensation of being trapped in someone else's narrative. How many times had she been accused of things she hadn't done, simply because her background made her an easy target? "Where is this supposed evidence of debt?" Harvey demanded. Blackwood produced another folder. Inside were documents that made Keisha's blood run cold, loan agreements bearing her signature, letters from creditors demanding payment, bank statements showing deposits that corresponded exactly with the dates the items went missing. "I never signed these," Keisha said, her voice hollow. "I've never seen these papers before in my life." "Forgery is a serious accusation, Miss Williams. These documents have been verified by handwriting experts." Harvey grabbed the papers, scanning them with the intensity of someone searching for exits in a burning building. Keisha watched his face, waiting for doubt to creep in, for that inevitable moment when belief gave way to suspicion. It was what always happened. People might claim to trust you, but when evidence appeared, when the world confirmed their worst assumptions, trust evaporated like morning frost. "This is Edmund's doing," Harvey said, his voice deadly quiet. "This has his fingerprints all over it." "That's a very convenient conspiracy theory, Your Grace. My clients are merely concerned citizens attempting to protect the duchy from exploitation." "Your clients are vultures circling an inheritance they were never entitled to." Harvey stood, his full height and authority suddenly filling the room. "Get out of my house." "It's afraid it's not so simple." Blackwood remained infuriatingly calm. "My clients have filed a formal complaint with the magistrate. There will be an investigation, and given Miss Williams' precarious social position, I imagine the authorities will be quite thorough." He gathered his papers with practiced efficiency. "The Grand Assembly is in 3 weeks. I suspect by then the question of Miss Williams's character and your judgment in harboring her will be resolved, one way or another." After he left, the conservatory felt contaminated.
Keisha stood frozen, her mind racing through implications and consequences. She'd been so careful, so conscious of not touching anything that wasn't explicitly hers. She'd lived like a ghost in Harvey's house, afraid of leaving fingerprints on his life. And still, they'd found a way to make her guilty. They forged everything, Harvey said, pacing like a caged animal. The signatures, the debts, probably planted the items somewhere to be discovered later. It's classic Edmund: create a crisis, position himself as the solution. It doesn't matter, Keisha said quietly. Real or forged, the story is already written. Common girl seduces reclusive duke, steals from him, proves he's too damaged to protect his own interests. They'll use this to declare you unfit, and I'll be the weapon that destroys you. Harvey stopped pacing, his eyes fierce. No! The word was absolute. Harvey crossed to her, gripping her shoulders with barely restrained intensity. You stood up to them once. We'll do it again, together. Harvey, do you trust me? It was the question that mattered most. Keisha looked into his face, scarred, fierce, utterly certain, and made her choice. Yes, then let them set their trap. We'll spring it on our own terms. The Grand Assembly made the winter gala look like a children's tea party. Every major aristocratic family in England had descended upon the Kensington Grand Hall, a cathedral of wealth and judgment where reputations were built and demolished with equal efficiency. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung from gilded ceilings, and the guest list read like a directory of everyone who'd ever mattered or wanted to. Keisha stood in Harvey's foyer, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror, barely recognizing herself. The dress Harvey had commissioned was a masterpiece, deep emerald silk that made her skin glow, cut with architectural precision that somehow made her scars look intentional rather than accidental. Her hair was swept up, exposing her neck and the delicate line of her jaw. She looked like someone who belonged. It was terrifying. "Ready?" Harvey appeared behind her, devastating in black tie, his scarred hands adjusting his cufflinks with the studied casualness of someone preparing for battle. "They're going to eat us alive," Keisha said. "Probably," Harvey's reflections smiled grimly, "but we'll taste terrible going down." The car ride was silent, charged with the tension of soldiers heading to war. When they pulled up to the Grand Hall, camera flashes exploded like artillery fire. The press had been waiting, hungry for the scandal that had dominated headlines for weeks. Duke's companion accused of theft, Ashworth heir's judgment questioned, Grand Assembly to address ducal fitness. Harvey exited first, then turned and offered his hand, his bare, scarred hand, to Keisha. She took it, and together they walked through the gauntlet of flashing lights and shouted questions like royalty approaching the guillotine. Inside, the whispers were deafening. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as they entered. Keisha felt 1,000 eyes cataloguing every detail, every imperfection, storing ammunition for later dissection. But Harvey's hand remained steady in hers, an anchor in the storm of scrutiny. "There they are," he murmured, "the executioners." Edmund and Marguerite stood near the dais where the Assembly's formal proceedings would take place, surrounded by a cluster of allies, other old-money families who viewed Harvey's modernization efforts as betrayal, who saw Keisha proof that the aristocracy was being infiltrated by undesirables. Lady Thornbury was there too, her expression radiating vindication. She'd been right about Keisha all along, her face seemed to say. The working-class girl had proven to be exactly what society expected: a thief, an opportunist, a cautionary tale. The evening's master of ceremonies, Lord Pemberton, a bloodless bureaucrat who served as the Assembly's chancellor, called the room to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather for our annual assembly, but this year brings matters of unusual gravity." His voice carried the forced neutrality of someone deeply enjoying the drama. "A formal challenge has been filed regarding the fitness of Harvey Kendrick Mart, Duke of Ashworth, to maintain his title and estate."
The audience erupted in murmurs. Even those who'd expected this seemed thrilled by the spectacle. Edmund stepped forward, his expression a calculated mixture of sorrow and duty. "It brings me no pleasure to stand before you today. Harvey is family, but family doesn't mean ignoring reality when someone we love is clearly unable to fulfill their responsibilities." "Get to the point, Edmund," Harvey said coldly from across the room. "Very well. I submit that Harvey has demonstrated catastrophically poor judgment by installing a woman of questionable character in a position of trust, a woman who has stolen from the estate, who has exploited Harvey's isolation and vulnerability for personal gain. The evidence is irrefutable. Miss Williams is currently under investigation for theft, yet Harvey defends her, even now, proving he cannot distinguish between genuine companionship and calculated manipulation." Marguerite produced documents, the forged debts, the missing items inventory, witness statements from concerned staff members. The evidence spread across the presentation screen like a prosecution's closing argument. "We ask this assembly to declare Harvey temporarily unfit and to appoint a trustee to manage the estate until such time as he demonstrates restored judgment for his own protection." The room held its breath, waiting for Harvey's defense, his collapse, his retreat back into the shadows where damaged dukes belonged. Instead, Harvey began to laugh. It wasn't hysterical or defeated. It was the laugh of someone who'd just watched an elaborate trap spring on the wrong target. He walked to the center of the hall, pulling Keisha with him, positioning them directly in the spotlight. "You want to question my judgment?" Harvey's voice cut through the assembly like a blade. "Then let's examine yours. Let's discuss the estate funds you've been siphoning, Edmund, the properties you've sold without authorization, the bribes you've paid to magistrates to ensure this investigation moved forward despite lacking any legitimate evidence." Edmund's face went from purple to gray. "That's a lie." "It's documented extensively." Harvey produced his own folder, thicker, more detailed, devastating. "I've spent 3 years letting you think I was hiding. In reality, I was watching, learning, collecting proof of every corrupt transaction, every manipulated account, every lie you told while positioning yourself to steal what you were never entitled to inherit." The assembly stirred, attention shifting from Keisha to Edmund like spectators at a tennis match. "And Miss Williams?" Marguerite's voice was shrill with panic. "The stolen items?" "Were never stolen," Keisha said, her voice steady beside her thundering heart. "They were moved to secure storage 3 months ago, long before I arrived. The photographs showing them missing are fraudulent, taken after you accessed the estate under false pretenses and staged the scenes yourselves." Harvey's solicitor emerged from the crowd, carrying boxes of evidence that suddenly made Edmund's accusations look like amateur theater. "This assembly can vote on my fitness," Harvey said, his gaze sweeping the room, "but I suggest you first consider whether Edmund's fitness to challenge anyone's judgment when he's currently facing criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and perjury." The hall exploded into chaos. Edmund lunged forward, restrained by security. Marguerite's mask of composure shattered completely, and Keisha stood beside Harvey, their scarred hands intertwined, watching the trap consume its architects. They'd come to be judged. Instead, they'd delivered judgment.
The silence after chaos was always the most dangerous. Edmund had been escorted out by security, his protests echoing through the hall like the death throes of a dynasty. Marguerite had simply vanished, her ice-blue gown disappearing into the crowd like a ghost, realizing it had lost its haunting privileges. But the assembly remained, hundreds of aristocrats staring at Harvey and Keisha with expressions ranging from shock to calculation to something approaching respect. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat, his bureaucratic composure badly shaken. "In light of these revelations, the challenge to the Duke of Ashworth's fitness is hereby withdrawn. However," He paused, and Keisha felt the shift in the room, the predatory interest of people who'd just lost one scandal and were hungry for another. There remains the question of Miss Williams's position, her suitability as the Duke's companion, given her background. It was Lady Thornbury who stood, her voice dripping with false concern. Surely we can all agree that while Miss Williams may be innocent of theft, she remains fundamentally inappropriate for a ducal household, a working-class girl with no breeding, no education in the responsibilities of our world. Harvey, dear boy, you've proven your judgment sound in business matters. Don't undermine that victory by clinging to a relationship that can only diminish your standing. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. The verdict was clear. Keisha could be not guilty and still be unwanted. She could be innocent and still be considered unworthy. Keisha felt Harvey's hand tighten on hers, felt him preparing to defend her again, but something crystallized inside her chest, hot and bright and utterly certain. She'd spent her entire life letting other people define her worth, measure her value, decide whether she deserved to exist in rooms they controlled. Not anymore. She stepped forward, releasing Harvey's hand, standing alone in the gilded hall. Want to know what makes someone untouchable? Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear and unflinching. I thought I knew. I thought it was these. She held up her scarred hands, letting the chandeliers illuminate every ridge and valley. I thought being marked by fire, by work, by survival made me someone people would always recoil from, someone who didn't belong in rooms like this, with people like you. The assembly watched transfixed. But I was wrong about what untouchable means. You are untouchable, not because you're too damaged, but because you're too protected, too insulated by money and breeding and the certainty that you'll never have to fight for anything real. Keisha's gaze swept the room, landing on faces she'd once feared. You've never touched hardship, never touched genuine loss, never touched the kind of desperation that teaches you what matters and what's just performance. Lady Thornbury opened her mouth to protest, but Keisha continued, relentless. Harvey and we've touched all of it, fire and glass, and the sharp edges of a world that wanted us to disappear. Our hands are scarred because we didn't have the luxury of gloves to protect us. And yes, that makes us different from you, but it doesn't make us less. It makes us real. She turned to Harvey, who was staring at her with something like awe. You asked me once why I grabbed your hand that night. The truth is, I recognized you. Not your title, not your reputation. You, another person who'd been told their damage made them unworthy, who'd spent years hiding because it seemed easier than fighting. Her voice softened. But we're done hiding, both of us. Harvey crossed to her in 3 strides, taking her scarred hands in his scarred hands, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. I'm right, he said, loud enough for the assembly to hear. I've spent 3 years in that alcove, 3 years managing this dukery like a business rather than a legacy, 3 years convinced that keeping myself separate was the same as keeping myself safe. He looked at the assembled aristocracy with something approaching pity. But safety isn't the same as living, and I choose life. I choose Keisha. I choose building something new, rather than preserving something that was broken from the start. Harvey, Lord Pemberton said carefully, think about what you're saying, your position, your responsibilities. Can be fulfilled by someone who actually values them. Edmund might have been corrupt, but he was right in one thing. I never wanted this. The title, the estate, the endless performance of aristocratic duty. I inherited an obligation, not a calling. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Dukes didn't abdicate. Dukes didn't walk away. I'm not abandoning my responsibilities. I'm restructuring them. The estate will be converted into a trust, professionally managed, with proceeds supporting educational and artistic programs for people like Keisha, people who have talent and drive but lack access. The title can pass to whichever distant cousin wants the privilege of attending assemblies like this for the rest of their life. He turned to Keisha, his smile fierce and free. And I'll be busy building something that actually matters, with the woman who taught me that scars aren't shameful, they're just proof we survived long enough to start again. Keisha felt tears threatening, but they weren't tears of humiliation or defeat. They were the tears of someone who'd spent years carrying weight that was never theirs to bear, finally setting it down. "So you see," Harvey said, addressing the assembly one final time, "you're welcome to consider us untouchable. We consider it a compliment." They walked out together, through the shocked silence and camera flashes, through the judgment and the whispers, and the future they were choosing over the past. Behind them, the grand assembly dissolved into chaos. Ahead of them, the night was dark and uncertain, and entirely theirs. In the car, Keisha finally asked the question that mattered most. What now? Harvey laced his fingers through hers, scarred hands intertwined like a promise. Now, we build something worthy of our scars, a legacy that celebrates survival instead of hiding from it. Art programs, music schools, opportunities for people who've been told they're too damaged to deserve them. Harvey brought her hand to his lips, kissing each scarred knuckle like a benediction. We make untouchable mean something beautiful. Keisha leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the city lights blur past the window. They'd come to the assembly expecting judgment. Instead, they'd delivered liberation for themselves and perhaps eventually for everyone who'd ever been told their scars made them unworthy. The hands of fate, it turned out, were scarred and strong and capable of building futures that refused to apologize for surviving the past. And somewhere in the glass fortress they were leaving behind, a piano waited to be played by two people who'd finally learned that the most beautiful music came from fingers that had earned the right to create it.